The Seas of Dragonfall? The Seas of Dragonfall update? Sorry, y'all, just being cruel now. What's going on, everyone? Juicebags here. Welcome back to some Dungeon Defenders 2. Let's just talk about these dragons, y'all. The big nerf bat swung in the Seas of Dragonfall update. Obviously, there's some big changes to dragons. Now, the range and the damage both got nerfs. Now, the range nerf is pretty significant. The damage nerf is very small. The trouble is when you combine a range, or when you give a defense a range nerf, you are also giving it a damage nerf already, because the defense is not going to be able to hit the enemy as many times as it did before, because before the range was bigger. So we got kind of a double whammy on the dragons, no doubt. Now, can they still be used? Well, not really in the way that you used to use them before. So if you used to spam like one big set of dragons, or, you know, like I was a big fan of that 400 DU build, the 400 DU build where I would go like this and go 6 dragons and a Boostara and a Destructive Pylon and a Buff Beam. I mean, this was my go-to build. I based everything with dragons off of this. If I only had 300 DU to spend, or if I had 350 DU, I got rid of a dragon. If I only had 300 to spend, I got rid of 2 dragons, etc., etc., all the way down to 200 DU with only 2 dragons. Now, the problem with this is there's just not anywhere near enough range for this build to be effective any longer. So what do? Do we take the Countess and throw her in the trash and head over to Reddit and start screaming? Well, of course not. We see what we can do to make these better in their current form. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the change, and one of the big things that I am not a fan about is the DU cost is still the same. The effectiveness of this defense got lowered greatly, but the DU stayed the same. You can't really change the DU because of the motherly instinct on the Elder Dragon. It would make it completely broken if we were able to spam an additional 10 dragons down. So I understand why they didn't change the DU. However, I do think it could be debatable on whether or not this is still a defense that's worth using at 50 DU. You're almost always, with probably very niche situations, you're always going to have a wall in the mix in Chaos 10 to use these guys now. However, they are still usable, y'all. You just have to adapt. Now, what's the first thing we do right out of the gates? Well, the first thing that came to my mind was the range is terrible. So, do we really need Dragon's Haste anymore? Mass Destruction, and Dragon's Haste was the natural go-to. Is this something we really need? Well, the range is so small, the dragons don't have very far to fly. So, do they really need to be Zoomers? Or can they go without it? I think realistically they can go without it because they've just got next to no distance to travel in comparison to before. Now, that frees up a shard slot where we can add more power. Now, sadly, on the dragons, there is not a triple stack, so you've got a few different options. You've got things like, well, I mean, you could just go with more range if you wanted to get to the range cap and go with Deadly Strikes. However, you can go with things like Vampiric Empowerment, things like Power Transfer are all going to help this defense recover some of that damage that was lost. So let's take a look at it. Now, first off, when you're changing your shards, always change the shard based off of how you use it. So it's going to be different for every person. Not everyone is going to throw a Buff Beam and a Boostar on their dragons. So you have to keep that in mind. So when we look at just the default Dragon's Nest, with this setup, without a third shard slot, we're doing 624,000 tooltip DPS with nothing else in the mix. Now, if we add in, say, Vampiric Empowerment, this is going to take that up to 750,000 tooltip DPS. And if we change this to, say, Power Transfer, that's going to take it up to 743,000 tooltip DPS. Now, at first glance, you're going to say, okay, well, Vampiric's better. However, this is not how I use my dragons. How I use my dragons, as I already mentioned, is with a boost aura, with a destructive pylon, and with a buff beam. So let's take a look at them once again, once all that stuff gets implemented. So let's let this stuff get buffed up. If we look at our dragon now, it's doing 1.72 million tooltip DPS with an empty shard slot. If we plug in the Vampiric Empowerment, give it a second here to refresh, that's going to take it up to 1.93 million DPS. And if we add in a power transfer, that's going to take it up to 2 million, or just over 2 million DPS. So in the situation where I personally use the dragons, the power transfer is going to be better than the Vampiric. Well, what about after we upgrade it? Because we're not going to not upgrade our dragons, right? So let's take our dragon all the way up. Let's give it just a second here. And we see now the Dragon's Nest is at 3.56 million tooltip DPS with power transfer. And if we go with Vamp instead, it's going to drop down to 3.09 million tooltip DPS. So in my personal situation, power transfer is going to be better. Now, looking at it now, the new range cap on the dragons is 3,500 range units. We're at 3,069 range units. So we're about just under 500 away from the range cap without adding any additional range. If we take a look at the range, it's not glorious. There's no doubt about it. It is a much smaller range. However, I am anxious to get in and test this on some maps. You're not going to be able to build the same way you used to, y'all. The one big dragon stack to cover a huge area, or 2 or 3 big dragon stacks on an entire map, are not going to be the ways to go. The dragons are still putting out enough damage to clear Chaos 10 content without a doubt. However, you are going to have to build things out a little different. So instead of going with that big super stack, it is probably going to be time to consider eating a dragon and going with some smaller stacks. So, could go something like this. That one is only going to be 250 DU. That's going to allow me, if I do that twice, say if I had 2 600 or 2 400 DU stacks before, if I go in 250 DU only, that's going to allow me to do this setup 3 times instead of the 2 setups, the 2 full 400 DU setups. So make some adjustments, y'all. I will definitely be doing some test runs and some videos over the upcoming days, trying out the dragons in different maps. It was a pretty meaty change, there's no doubt about it. However, don't despair quite yet if you are a big fan of the Countess and the dragons. I personally am a very large fan of the Countess and a very large fan of the dragons. So I'm going to do everything I can to try to get these working. Now, the one thing I can see right out of the gates is before, you could pretty much clear most maps with dragons and then some anti-heal, or dragons and some walls. I think now, in the current state, I really believe that walls are going to be required. So get some walls out there. Now, with the DU cost not changing, we're not going to have a whole lot of DU, because this is a very expensive defense, which means we're going to have to start thinking about what walls we want to use. Werewolf walls, although they did get a little nerf as well, are still quite beast and can, pretty much handle everything. But they're expensive, and that's the challenge there. So might be time to bust out that Squire training dummy again and let it scream once more. A lot of people still use it all the time now, as it is just incredibly good. But consider adding in some walls to your build, and then I'll do my best to get a few builds out there showcasing the dragons in their current state. Once again, by all means, I am not a fan of nerfs, ever. Really, in any game. However, I am a fan of the dragons, and I don't want to give up on the dragons. I still want to use them, and we will find some ways to make that happen. But that will do it for now, y'all. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Dragon Nerf Bat in the Seas of Dragonfall update in Dungeon Defenders 2. But thank you all so much for watching, and I will see ya next time around. Take it easy.